Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a deep dive into The Scapegoat by René Girard.
Ooh,
Have you heard of this one?
I have.
I have to admit this one's a bit intense even for us.
It is a powerful book, that's for sure,
Yeah.
but also a fascinating one.
Okay.
Girard's basic premise is that scapegoating,
Right.
this idea of blaming and punishing an innocent person or group for society's problems, is not just some random historical quirk.
Oh, interesting.
It's actually woven into the very fabric of human culture.
Okay, so we're not just talking about a few isolated incidents here.
Nope.
We're talking about a fundamental pattern of human behavior.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay.
Girard argues that this scapegoat mechanism is driven by what he calls mimetic desire.
Okay.
The idea that we want what others want, which leads to rivalry, jealousy, and eventually violence.
Mm-hmm.
Societies need a way to release this tension.
Right.
And that's where the scapegoat comes in.
So it's like a pressure cooker,
Yes.
and the scapegoat is the release valve.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And to illustrate this point, Girard dives deep into a wide range of examples.
Okay.
From ancient myths to historical accounts like Guillaume de Machaut's writings on the Black Death, all the way to the Bible itself.
Wow. He covers a lot of ground.
He does.
So to make sure I'm following, can we start with a quick summary of the book's main themes before we dive into the specifics?
Absolutely. Girard lays out a few key concepts.
Okay.
First, he argues that mimetic desire is this driving force behind conflict and violence.
Okay.
It's not that we inherently want certain things, but rather we want what others desire, leading to competition and rivalry.
That makes sense. I
Yeah.
could definitely see how that plays out in everyday life, like
Right.
wanting the latest gadget just because everyone else has it.
Exactly. And this desire isn't limited to material things. It applies to relationships, status, even ideas.
Oh, wow.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Right.
Because this mimetic rivalry creates tension and instability within a society. To resolve this, Girard says societies often resort to the scapegoat mechanism.
Okay.
They find someone to blame someone who can embody all that pent-up frustration and aggression.
And by punishing or expelling that scapegoat, they create a temporary sense of unity and order.
Precisely. But here's the twist.
Okay.
Girard argues that the scapegoat is always innocent.
Oh,
They are not truly responsible for the problems they're being blamed for. They're simply convenient targets.
so it's not about finding the real culprit. It's about finding someone to blame to restore a sense of peace.
Exactly. And to understand how this works,
Mm-hmm.
Girard identifies these recurring stereotypes of persecution that pop up again and again in these scapegoat narratives.
Stereotypes, like what?
Think about those classic accusations.
Okay.
Harming children, desecrating sacred objects, engaging in taboo acts.
Right.
These charges often target groups that are already marginalized or seen as different.
Mm-hmm.
If you see these kinds of accusations flying around, it's a good sign that there's some scapegoating going on.
Okay, that's a really helpful insight.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the individual victim.
Right.
It's about how those accusations play into existing societal prejudices.
Exactly. Now, this is where Girard's analysis of myths comes in.
Okay.
He sees myths as disguised accounts of this collective violence, often with a scapegoat at the center.
So those ancient Greek myths I vaguely remember from school, like Oedipus and all that,
Yeah.
they're actually about scapegoating.
That's what Girard argues. Take Oedipus, for example.
Okay.
He's ultimately blamed for a plague that's ravaging Thebes.
Right, right.
Girard argues that this plague is a representation of the social chaos and violence that are unleashed by mimetic desire.
Mm-hmm.
And Oedipus, despite his own tragic flaws, becomes the scapegoat, the one who must be sacrificed to restore order.
So it's not that Oedipus is literally responsible for the plague,
Right.
but he becomes a symbol of all the things that are wrong with Thebes at that moment.
Exactly. And by exiling him, the community believes they're purging themselves of those problems. They're creating a sense of unity and purification through the sacrifice of an individual.
That's a pretty bleak view of human nature.
It is.
But I can see how it connects to what we talked about earlier, how scapegoating is often used to create a sense of social cohesion in times of crisis.
Precisely. And Girard argues that this pattern is not unique to ancient Greece. We see it in myths from all over the world.
Okay.
Take the story of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome.
Oh, yeah, the twins raised by a she-wolf.
Yes.
Wait, wasn't one of them killed?
Yes. Romulus kills Remus in a dispute over the founding of Rome.
Right.
Girard interprets this fratricide as the symbolic representation of the violence that's often necessary to establish a new social order.
So even the founding myths of nations are often based on this act of scapegoating.
That's what Girard suggests. He argues that these myths are not just stories.
Right.
They're reflecting a deeper truth about how societies are formed and how they maintain order.
Okay, that's a pretty mind-blowing idea.
Right.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the Bible. You mentioned earlier that Girard sees the Bible as actually subverting the scapegoat mechanism.
He does.
Can you unpack that a little more? It seems like a contradiction.
It does seem like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
After all, the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is full of violence and sacrifice.
Right.
But Girard argues that there's a crucial difference between how the Bible portrays violence compared to those ancient myths.
Oh, okay.
He points to the story of Jesus as the ultimate example.
Right, Jesus the ultimate scapegoat.
Yes.
But you're saying the Gospels present his death differently.
Exactly. Think about those classic myths we've been discussing. They tend to justify the violence against the scapegoat.
Right.
They present it as necessary, even divinely ordained. But the Gospels do the opposite.
Okay.
They portray Jesus as completely innocent, falsely accused, and unjustly condemned.
So instead of legitimizing the violence, the Gospels are actually condemning it.
Precisely. They're showing us the scapegoat mechanism in all its ugliness, and they're inviting us to see things from the victim's perspective. They're basically saying, look, this is what happens when we give in to our fears and our desire for revenge.
Wow.
This is what happens when we scapegoat someone.
Wow. That's a powerful message. It's like the Bible is saying, hey, we've been doing this scapegoating thing for centuries, and it's time to stop.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
Girard sees the Gospels as a kind of turning point in human history, a moment when the scapegoat mechanism was finally exposed and challenged.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects.
Good.
But before we dive into the biblical examples, I'm really curious about that Michaud account of the Black Death.
Okay.
Can you walk me through that a little more?
Sure.
That seems like a pretty powerful example of scapegoating in action.
Absolutely. Michaud, this French poet writing during the 14th century, describes the horrors of the Black Death firsthand.
Oh, wow.
And what's striking is how he depicts the wave of persecution against Jews who were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague.
Wow, blaming an entire group for a pandemic.
Yep.
That's a pretty stark example of scapegoating.
It is, and Girard uses this account to show how, in times of crisis, societies often lash on to pre-existing prejudices and stereotypes to find someone to blame.
Yeah.
It's like a reflex, a way to create a simple explanation for something that is terrifying and complex.
So instead of trying to understand the real causes of the plague, they found it easier to blame a group that was already marginalized and feared.
Exactly. And Michaud's account isn't just a historical curiosity. Girard argues that this same pattern plays out again and again throughout history. We see it in the witch hunts, in political persecutions, and even in our own contemporary society.
Okay, that's a sobering thought. But before we get too deep into the modern implications, let's stick with Michaud for a moment.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that Girard identifies these stereotypes of persecution that pop up in scapegoat narratives.
Yes.
Did any of those stereotypes show up in Michaud's account of the Black Death?
They absolutely did. Michaud describes how Jews were accused of poisoning wells and spreading disease, accusations that played into existing anti-Semitic stereotypes and fears about outsiders contaminating the community.
So those stereotypes weren't just random accusations. They were strategically chosen to tap into existing fears and prejudices.
Exactly. And Girard argues that those stereotypes are a key part of how the scapegoat mechanism works.
Right.
They make it easier to dehumanize the victims and to justify the violence against them. It's not just about punishing an individual. It's about reinforcing the boundaries of the community and expelling anything that is perceived as threatening or impure.
Wow. This is really starting to make sense.
Good.
So we've got this underlying mechanism of mimetic desire leading to conflict.
Right.
And then society finds a scapegoat to blame and punish in order to restore order.
Yep.
And those accusations often rely on these pre-existing stereotypes that make it easier to target certain groups.
Precisely. And what's so unsettling is that this mechanism can operate even when people genuinely believe they're doing the right thing.
Oh.
They might truly believe that the scapegoat is guilty, that they're protecting their community by punishing them.
So it's not always about conscious malice. It's about these deeper psychological and social forces that are at work.
Exactly. And that's why Girard believes it's so important to understand this mechanism.
Okay.
He wants us to see how it operates, to recognize the warning signs, and to resist the urge to participate in it.
This has definitely given me a lot to think about. So we've got a good grasp on the basic concepts, and we've seen how they played out in a historical example with Michaud's account of the Black Death.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Well, now that we've laid the groundwork, we can start to explore how Girard applies the scapegoat mechanism to the realm of myths.
Okay.
And this is where things get really interesting,
Okay.
because he argues that myths are not simply stories. They're actually disguised accounts of this primal act of violence that lies at the heart of human culture.
Okay. I'm ready to dive into those myths.
Great.
But can we take a quick break first before we launch into ancient Greece?
Yeah.
My brain needs a moment to process all of this.
Of course. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've covered so far,
Oh.
and then we'll delve into the world of myths and see how the scapegoat mechanism plays out in some of those classic stories.
Sounds good. Grab a drink, stretch your legs, and we'll be right back to explore the fascinating world of myths and scapegoats.
All right. Are you ready to journey back to ancient Greece? Because that's where Girard takes us next in the scapegoat.
Okay.
He argues that these myths, the ones we often think of as just stories,
Right.
are actually encoded with profound truths about human behavior, particularly this scapegoat mechanism.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
Mm-hmm.
But how can stories about gods and monsters tell us anything real about ourselves? It all seems a bit far-fetched.
That's what's so brilliant about Girard's approach. He suggests that these myths, despite their fantastical elements, are actually symbolic representations of the very same patterns of violence and scapegoating that we see throughout history. Remember those stereotypes of persecution we talked about earlier? They pop up in myths, too.
So we're going to see accusations of harming children, violating sacred things, all that playing out in these ancient stories.
Exactly. And Girard argues that by understanding these myths, we can gain a deeper understanding of how the scapegoat mechanism operates on a psychological and social level. It's like these stories are giving us a window into the collective unconscious of humanity.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could be really insightful. But can we get specific?
Sure.
Which myths does Girard analyze, and what does he see in them?
Well, he examines a wide range of myths.
Okay.
But one of the most famous examples is the story of Oedipus. You know, the guy who unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother.
Oh, yeah, that Oedipus, tragic dude.
Yeah.
But what's the scapegoat angle there?
Well, remember how Oedipus is ultimately blamed for a plague that's ravaging Thebes?
Uh-huh.
Girard argues that this plague is a representation of the social chaos and violence that are unleashed by mimetic desire.
Okay.
And Oedipus, despite his own tragic flaws, becomes the scapegoat, the one who must be sacrificed to restore order.
So it's not that Oedipus is literally responsible for the plague,
Right.
but he becomes a symbol of all the things that are wrong with Thebes at that moment.
Exactly. And by exiling him, the community believes they're purging themselves of those problems. They're creating a sense of unity and purification through the sacrifice of an individual.
That's a pretty bleak view of human nature.
It is.
But I can see how it connects to what we talked about earlier, how scapegoating is often used to create a sense of social cohesion in times of crisis.
Precisely. And Girard argues that this pattern is not unique to ancient Greece. We see it in myths from all over the world.
Interesting.
Take the story of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome.
Oh, yeah. The twins raised by a she-wolf. Wait, wasn't one of them killed?
Yes, Romulus kills Remus in a dispute over the founding of Rome.
Right.
Girard interprets this fratricide as a symbolic representation of the violence that's often necessary to establish a new social order.
So even the founding myths of nations are often based on this act of scapegoating.
That's what Girard suggests. He argues that these myths are not just stories. They're reflecting a deeper truth about how societies are formed and how they maintain order.
Okay, that's a pretty mind-blowing idea.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the Bible.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that Girard sees the Bible as actually subverting the scapegoat mechanism.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little more? It seems like a contradiction.
It does seem like a contradiction, doesn't it? After all, the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is full of violence and sacrifice.
Yeah.
But Girard argues that there's a crucial difference between how the Bible portrays violence compared to those ancient myths.
Okay, so how's it different?
He points to the story of Jesus as the ultimate example.
Right, Jesus, the ultimate scapegoat.
Eh.
But you're saying the Gospels present his death differently.
Exactly. Think about this classic myths we've been discussing.
Yeah.
They tend to justify the violence against the scapegoat. They present it as necessary, even divinely ordained. But the Gospels do the opposite. They portray Jesus as completely innocent, falsely accused, and unjustly condemned.
So instead of legitimizing the violence, the Gospels are actually condemning it.
Precisely. They're showing us the scapegoat mechanism in all its ugliness, and they're inviting us to see things from the victim's perspective. They're basically saying, look, this is what happens when we give in to our fears and our desire for revenge. This is what happens when we scapegoat someone.
Wow, that's a powerful message. It's like the Bible is saying, hey, we've been doing this scapegoating thing for centuries, and it's time to stop.
That's a great way to put it. Girard sees the Gospels as a kind of turning point in human history, a moment when the scapegoat mechanism was finally exposed and challenged.
Okay, if I'm starting to see how this all connects.
Good.
But if the Gospels are so anti-scapegoating, how does Girard explain all the violence that has been committed in the name of Christianity throughout history?
That's a great question, and it's one that Girard addresses head-on. He acknowledges that Christianity, like all religions, has been used to justify violence and oppression at times.
Yeah, I mean, the Crusades, the Inquisitions,
Yeah.
and not exactly peaceful moments in history.
No, they weren't. But Girard argues that those instances of violence are actually betrayals of the true Christian message. He says they're a result of what he calls bad mimesis.
Bad mimesis, that's a new one. What does that mean?
Remember how we talked about mimetic desire and how it can lead to both good and bad outcomes?
Yeah.
Girard believes that the same principle applies to mimesis in general. There's good mimesis, which is about imitating positive models,
Okay.
like Jesus, who taught love, compassion, and forgiveness.
Okay, so following the example of someone who embodies those values.
Exactly. But then there's bad mimesis, which is about imitating negative models. It's about getting caught up in cycles of rivalry, jealousy, and violence.
Right.
And unfortunately, throughout history, some people claiming to be Christians have fallen into the trap of bad mimesis. They've imitated the violence of the crowd rather than the love and forgiveness of Jesus.
So they've used Christianity as a justification for violence, even though that goes against the core message of the Gospels.
Exactly. And Girard sees this as a warning for all of us. He argues that we need to be very careful about who we choose as our models,
Okay.
and to be aware of how mimetic desire can lead us astray.
Okay, that's a powerful message.
Mhm.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap of bad mimesis? What are some practical steps we can take to resist the scapegoat mechanism, especially in the modern world, where it's often more hidden and subtle?
Well, first and foremost, Girard emphasizes the importance of awareness. He argues that we need to be able to recognize the scapegoat mechanism when it's happening both in ourselves and in the world around us.
So it's about paying attention to those patterns, those stereotypes of persecution, those attempts to simplify complex issues by blaming individuals or groups.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to be able to see through the rhetoric, to question the narratives that we're presented with, and to resist the urge to jump on the bandwagon. And this is where education comes in. The more we understand about history, about psychology, about the subtle ways in which power operates, the better equipped we'll be to resist those manipulative forces.
So knowledge is power in a way.
Absolutely. But knowledge is not enough. Girard also emphasizes the importance of empathy.
Okay.
He argues that we need to cultivate a sense of compassion for those who are different from us, to see the world from their perspective, and to recognize their humanity.
That makes sense. It's harder to scapegoat someone when you see them as a human being with their own hopes, fears, and struggles.
Precisely. And this is where literature, art, and even personal storytelling can play a crucial role.
Right.
They can help us to break down those barriers, to step outside of our own limited perspectives, and to connect with others on a deeper level.
So it's not just about understanding the scapegoat mechanism intellectually. It's about cultivating our emotional intelligence, our capacity for empathy and compassion.
Exactly. And Girard believes that this is essential if we want to create a more just and peaceful world. Because ultimately, the scapegoat mechanism is not just about individual acts of violence, it's about a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world that divides us into us and them. And until we can overcome that division, we'll always be susceptible to the lure of scapegoating.
Okay, this has been a truly eye-opening conversation. Girard's book is definitely a challenging read, but it's also incredibly insightful and relevant to the world we live in today.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, there's one more thing I'm curious about. Girard talks about the role of the paraclete in revealing the truth about scapegoating. Who or what is the paraclete, and how does it fit into all of this?
That's a great question. The Paraclete, also known as the Holy Spirit, is a key figure in Christian theology.
Yep.
And Girard sees the Paraclete as a kind of divine force that's working to expose the scapegoat mechanism and to lead humanity towards a more just and compassionate world.
It was like a force for good that's battling against the forces of scapegoating and violence.
That's a good way to put it. Girard argues that the Paraclete works through individuals and movements throughout history, inspiring people to challenge injustice and to defend the victims of scapegoating.
So it's not just about passive awareness. It's about actively working to resist scapegoating and to create a better world.
Exactly. And Girard believes that this work is essential if we want to break free from the cycle of violence that has plagued humanity for centuries.
So much to think about with all this. You know, we've talked about ancient myths, the Black Death, the Bible, but it feels like all of this is still so relevant today. Like, how does this scapegoat mechanism play out in like the modern world?
Yeah, you're right. Girard was really concerned about this. He argued that it's become even more insidious because it's often like hidden beneath the surface.
Right, so it's not as obvious as like a public execution or something.
Exactly. Think about how certain groups are often targeted and blamed for societal problems these days.
Like who?
Well, immigrants, minorities, people with different religious beliefs,
Oh, yeah.
even those who simply hold opposing political views.
Oh, that's a good point. It's like they become scapegoats for like economic anxieties or like cultural shifts.
Exactly. It's easier to blame someone else than to actually, address the complex underlying issues.
Yeah, for sure. And this blame often relies on those same stereotypes of persecution that Girard identifies in the book, right?
Absolutely. We see accusations of like disloyalty or criminality, even threats to our way of life. It's pretty scary.
It's chilling how those same patterns keep repeating themselves. But it's not just about those large-scale societal issues, right? Girard also talks about how scapegoating operates in our personal lives, too.
That's right. Think about how we often blame others for our own mistakes or shortcomings.
Right.
It could be a coworker, a family member, even a romantic partner. We project our own frustrations and insecurities onto them, making them the scapegoat for our own unhappiness.
So it's not just about those big dramatic examples. It's also about those everyday moments where we like shift blame or avoid taking responsibility for our own actions.
Exactly. And this can have a really corrosive effect on our relationships. It creates resentment,
Yep.
undermines trust, and can even lead to cycles of abuse.
Wow, this is heavy stuff. So we've established that scapegoating is still a very real problem in the modern world, both on a societal level and in our personal lives.
Right.
But what can we do about it? Is there any hope for breaking free from this destructive cycle?
Girard believed he argued that the first step is awareness.
Right. Like recognizing when it's happening.
Exactly. But beyond that, he emphasizes the importance of cultivating empathy and compassion.
Okay, so like putting ourselves in the shoes of the other.
Yes, exactly. And this requires us to challenge our own prejudices and assumptions. It requires us to be willing to listen to those who are different from us, to understand their experiences, and to recognize our shared humanity.
That makes sense. But it's not always easy to do, especially in a world that's so polarized and divided these days.
I agree. It takes effort and a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones. But Girard believed it's essential if we want to create a more just and peaceful world.
Okay, so empathy is key. What else can we do to resist the scapegoat mechanism?
Well, Girard also talks about the importance of finding positive models to imitate.
Right, right.
Remember, we're all influenced by the people we surround ourselves with. So it's important to choose our role models wisely. Who are the people in our lives who embody those values of compassion, justice, and understanding who inspires us to be better versions of ourselves?
So instead of getting caught up in those cycles of rivalry and competition that we talked about earlier, we need to find people who inspire us to lift each other up.
Exactly. And this can be a really powerful antidote to the negativity and cynicism that often fuels the scapegoat mechanism.
Okay, so we've got awareness, empathy, and positive role models. Are there any other tools in Girard's toolkit for resisting scapegoating?
He also talks about the importance of what he calls the conversion of the heart. This is a bit more of a spiritual or philosophical concept,
Okay.
but I think it speaks to the need for a fundamental shift in our values and our way of seeing the world.
So it's not just about changing our behavior, it's about changing our hearts and minds.
Exactly. Girard believed that true lasting change requires us to move beyond the logic of blame and revenge to embrace a more compassionate and forgiving worldview.
Okay, so it's about challenging those deep-seated beliefs and assumptions that often lead to scapegoating.
Precisely. And Girard saw this as an ongoing process, a lifelong journey of self-reflection and growth.
Wow, this has been a truly insightful conversation. The Scapegoat is a challenging book, but it's also incredibly relevant to the world we live in today. It's given me a lot to think about, both in terms of how I see the world and how I interact with others.
I agree. It's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it, and I think that's a testament to the power of Girard's ideas.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive into the Scapegoat. I want to thank you, our expert, for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found this conversation thought-provoking and perhaps even transformative. Remember, the scapegoat mechanism is a powerful force, but it's not inevitable. By understanding how it works, by cultivating our empathy and compassion, and by using our voices for good, we can start to create a world where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected. And with that, we'll bid you farewell until next time. Keep those critical thinking caps on. And remember, the search for truth is an ongoing journey.